Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're ditching our merely uncomfortable hiking boots for something with a bit more medieval bite. The ironclad, guaranteed to chafe sabatons of a Knight Templar heading off on crusade. That's right. We're diving head first, and with our customary lack of good sense, into the world of holy warriors whose sacred missions often involved more dysentery than divinity, and whose idea of a travel itinerary made a one-way trip to a hornet's nest look like a spa day. We're here to uncover exactly why, despite the shiny armor and the righteous cause, life for a crusading Templar absolutely, unequivocally sucked. You've seen the type in all those glorious, Technicolor storybooks and pompous paintings, haven't you? The Knight Templar, steely-eyed, halo practically gleaming off his helmet, probably posing with one foot on a conveniently slain dragon, all while looking fashionably stoic in his gleaming white surcoat with that iconic red cross. He's the medieval superhero, isn't he? God's bouncer, ready to smite the ungodly, and probably invent chivalry in his lunch break. But trust me, being a real Knight Templar, especially one dragged across continents to the sun-blasted, politically bonkers Middle East, was nothing like that airbrushed, divinely sponsored action figure. It was filthy, backbreaking, frequently terrifying work. A masterclass in creative suffering where your main achievements were not dying of thirst, not being sold into slavery by your own allies, and maybe, just maybe, pointing your lance vaguely in the right direction. For most who took up that cross, it wasn't just hard. It profoundly, epically, biblically sucked. Think less holy avenger, and more sweaty, heavily armed lost tourist with a bad attitude and even worse digestion problems. The journey itself was an appetizer for an all-you-can-eat buffet of misery. The combat was less noble clash and more frantic, muddy stabbing. And the medical plan apparently consisted of prayer, leeches, and a grim acceptance of gangrene. So if you're ready to have your romantic notions of chivalry thoroughly trampled by the iron-shod boots of reality, do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. Click that little bell icon too, so you're promptly notified whenever we decide to ruin another historical fantasy. And please, let us know in the comments which other gloriously suffering historical figures you'd like us to investigate. We're always looking for new depths of historical awfulness to explore. Now find yourself a comfortable chair, something our Templar friend probably hadn't seen in months, unless it was a captured throne he wasn't allowed to sit on. Pour a glass of something that definitely isn't riddled with medieval bacteria. Close your eyes, if you will, and prepare to be unpleasantly transported. We're about to join a Knight Templar on a journey where the only thing more dangerous than the enemy was often the food, the water, and his own comrades. Welcome to the real Crusades. It's going to be a bumpy and probably quite smelly ride. So how did some poor soul end up as a Knight Templar, ready to trade in a perfectly good, if probably boring life, for a one-way ticket to hardship in a hot country? Did angels sing? Did a holy light shine down? Probably not. More likely, it was a mix of God, guilt, and a gentle shove out the family door. You weren't so much born into the Templar order as you were, well, let's say your career options as a third son of Lord Slightly Better Than Dirt were a bit limited. First son got the castle and the fancy title. Second son might get a nice plot of land and a slightly less fancy title. You got a pat on the head and a suggestion to find a useful, preferably far away, occupation. No silk pillows or endless banquets for you. Just the family's second best horse, the one with the limp, a legacy of owing people money, and the ever-present medieval smell of unwashed everything practically woven into your hand-me-down tunic. For many a young nobleman, the Templars looked like a decent gig, or at least a structured one. Your other choices might include becoming a not very important priest, which meant lots of Latin and less hitting things, or just loitering around your brother's castle trying to look useful and probably failing. The Templars offered a clear job, go east, fight people God allegedly wasn't fond of, and try not to die too messily. Plus, they had cool white cloaks. That probably swayed a few. Sure, the life expectancy isn't great, but the uniform is killer. Then there was the get out of trouble card. Maybe you were a bit too fond of starting sword fights in the local village, or you accidentally insulted a duke by calling his prize-winning pig dinner. Suddenly, dedicating your life to God in a very distant land seemed like a brilliant idea. Your family might even pack your bags for you, with a speed that was frankly a little insulting. Go with God, my son. And please, don't write. It was the medieval version of joining the circus, but with more prayers and a much higher chance of dysentery. Some, of course, were genuinely devout. They believed in the mission. They wanted to protect pilgrims, reclaim holy sites, and all that jazz. These were the earnest ones, probably a bit terrifying in their certainty. They'd be the ones polishing their helmets with extra vigor, convinced they were on a truly divine mission. Good for them. They'd need that enthusiasm when the divine mission involved digging latrines for a week in 90-degree heat. And don't forget the older knights, the ones who'd already lived a bit. Maybe they'd had their fill of boring local squabbles over who owned which pigsty. They might have looked at their life, full of fairly ordinary sins, and thought, right, time to balance the books with the man upstairs. Joining the Templars was a way to go out with a bang, or at least a lot of sweat and shouting, hopefully in God's good books. Or perhaps they just wanted to get away from their wives. We're not here to judge. Much. So our future Templar, probably young, a bit clueless, and not smelling too great, arrives for training. This wasn't like night school in the storybooks. From the moment he could lift a practice sword without dropping it on his own foot too often, he was put to work. By age, say, 16 or so, if he wasn't already scaring the local peasantry, he was now Templar property. Cheap, ready to be yelled at labor. His toys? Oh, such fun. He'd get a heavy wooden sword for practice, which mostly taught him how much it hurts to get hit by one. He'd get a shield, his new best friend, which he'd learn to hide behind when someone bigger and meaner ran at him. His playground? A muddy, dung-strewn patch of ground where he'd spend hours sweating and being told he was doing everything wrong. While other kids his age were out learning useful things like how to not starve, or perhaps enjoying a bit of pig chasing, he was mastering the art of looking fierce while trying not to faint in his new scratchy woolens. Fun games included, let's see who can carry the heaviest rocks the furthest without crying. And guess what we're eating today? Hint. It's brown and mushy again. And who was his teacher in this charming school of hard knocks and harder bread? Probably not some kindly old wizard type. More like a grumpy, scarred-up older knight they called Sergeant Knuckles, whose face looked like a well-used chopping block, and whose idea of a pep talk was a grunt and a pointy finger towards the enemy. His words were few. Mainly, again, swing wrong, Zrenya, and are you trying to get us all killed? He taught not with gentle words, but by making you do it 100 times, or by demonstrating a sword technique so fast you weren't sure you even saw it, only that you were suddenly on your backside wondering what just happened. Patience was for saints and people who weren't trying to prepare you for a life of constant peril. If you wanted a hug, you'd come to the wrong military monastic order. This was professional suffering, and school was officially in session. So, what was a typical Tuesday like for our valiant Knight Templar in the sun-drenched, God-forsaken lands of the Crusades? Did it involve chivalrous quests and rescuing damsels? Unlikely. More probable is that it involved sweat, boredom, the constant nagging fear of a surprise arrow, and a truly spectacular amount of dirt. Holidays? Weekends off? Personal days? Adorable concepts, really, but about as common for a Templar as a pet unicorn, or a refreshing bacteria-free drink of water. The only time off you got was if you were too wounded to stand or too delirious with fever to tell which end of a sword was the pointy one. Their schedule wasn't so much a daily grind as an eternal, unchanging cycle of devotional duties, hard labor, and the ever-present possibility of a violent, unpleasant death. A day likely began before the sun even bothered to crack a weary eyelid over the dusty horizon, probably with the clang of a bell that sounded suspiciously like a direct summons from a very irritated deity. First up, prayers. Lots of prayers. Because if you're going to spend your day tempting fate in a suit of hot metal, you'd better make sure your spiritual paperwork is in order. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was probably some stale bread that could double as a paving stone, maybe washed down with some thin, sour wine or water that tasted like it had already passed through several other digestive systems. Animal, vegetable, or mineral. Luxury it was not. It was fuel, and poor quality fuel at that. Then it was straight to whatever delightful tasks the order had in store for you. If you weren't actively on campaign, which we'll get to, life in a Templar castle or outpost was hardly a picnic. There was endless training, swinging heavy swords until your arms felt like overcooked noodles, riding practice under a sun that felt like a personal insult from God, and drills, drills, drills. Because nothing says holy warrior like being able to form a shield wall in your sleep. There was guard duty, standing for hours in that aforementioned metal suit, slowly baking like a potato in an oven, scanning the shimmering horizon for any sign of trouble, or just trying to stay awake. And let's not forget the chores. These were warrior monks, remember? That meant when they weren't fighting or praying, they were working. Mucking out stables. Horses produce a lot of muck, and it doesn't magically disappear. Repairing equipment, tending to the meager vegetable gardens if they had them, or perhaps even construction work, because castles didn't just build themselves. It was all profoundly unglamorous and designed to keep you too busy to think about how much your life currently sucked. There were no 5 o'clock quitting times. You worked until the work was done, or until it was time for more prayers, or until someone started screaming that the enemy was at the gates. Fun times. The environment itself was a relentless enemy. The Holy Land wasn't the green and pleasant land many of them had left behind. It was often rocky, dusty, and brutally hot. The sun wasn't a cheerful friend. It was a cosmic bully, beating down relentlessly, turning your armor into a personal sauna, and baking the ground until it was as hard as a Templar's Lenten bread. The wind wasn't a gentle caress. It was often a searing, sand-filled blast that felt like it was trying to peel your skin off, or a chilling desert night wind that cut right through your supposedly warm cloak and into your soul. And the local wildlife? Forget friendly squirrels. Think scorpions with a bad attitude. Snakes that didn't appreciate being trodden on by a mailed boot. And insects. Oh, the glorious biblical plagues of insects. Flies that wanted to lay eggs in your eyeballs. Mosquitoes that saw your exposed skin as a personal invitation to a feast. And fleas and lice that considered your woolen undergarments a 5-star hotel with a complimentary blood bank. And the sensory experience? A veritable symphony of suffering, designed by a committee of sadists. Let's start with the sounds. The constant clang of metal on metal, swords in the practice yard, blacksmiths hammering, armorers fixing dents, the endless braying of mules and whinnying of horses, animals that were probably just as miserable as the men, the shouting of orders, the chanting of prayers, the groans of the sick and wounded, and the ever-present buzzing of insects that seemed to have a personal vendetta against your eardrums. Silence was a rare and precious commodity, usually only found when you were about to be ambushed. Then there were the dominant discomforts. Imagine being permanently caked in a mixture of your own sweat, dust, and grime because baths were a luxury, and water was often too precious to waste on something as frivolous as personal hygiene. your skin would be a patchwork of sunburn, windburn, chafing from your armor, and a constellation of insect bites that you scratched raw in your sleep. Rope burns from handling rough gear, splinters from wooden fortifications, and the general aches and pains that come from living a hard physical life with no access to a good physiotherapist or even a comfortable chair. Heat rash was probably considered a fashionable accessory. And the smells. Oh, the olfactory tapestry of a Templar encampment. It was an ode to misery that would make a modern sewage worker gag. The rich, earthy aroma of unwashed bodies, hundreds of them, all sweating profusely in wool and leather. The tangy fragrance of overflowing latrines, because medieval sanitation was more of an optimistic theory than a practical reality. The metallic tang of blood, both old and new. Rotting food, animal dung, wood smoke, cheap incense trying and failing to cover up the other stenches, and the faint, sweet, sickly smell of infection and disease. It wasn't just a place. It was an experience, one that assaulted your nostrils from dawn till dusk and probably haunted your dreams. Your own BO was probably the least offensive smell you encountered all day, a comforting reminder that you were, at least, still producing odors, and therefore likely still alive. All right. So our Knight Templar is stuck in this charming daily grind. What about the gear he relied on? Surely, the famous Knights Templar, the elite fighting force, were kitted out with the absolute best, most reliable state-of-the-art equipment medieval Europe and the Holy Land had to offer? Well, best is a relative term, especially when state-of-the-art often meant slightly less likely to kill you than the older version. Their tools of the trade, weapons, armor, and even their trusty steeds were often just another cast of characters in the grand tragicomedy of their suffering, each with its own delightful personality quirks and a finely tuned ability to fail at the worst possible moment. Let's start with the star of the show, the sword. Ah, the noble blade, symbol of knighthood, dispenser of divine justice, and a surprisingly heavy, awkward lump of metal if you weren't used to it. A Templar's sword would have been a fairly straightforward cruciform hilt, double-edged, and designed more for brutal chopping and decisive thrusts than the fancy, balletic fencing you see in movies. It was a tool, a weapon of grim necessity. And like any tool, it had its moods. There was the eager beaver sword, which felt lively in the hand during drills, but then somehow developed an unhealthy attraction to getting stuck in an opponent's shield. Or, embarrassingly, a wooden practice dummy, just when you needed it most. Then there was Old Trusty, the sword that had seen a few too many battles, its edge nicked and its balance slightly off, giving your wrist a sympathetic ache just by looking at it. You knew its every flaw like a problematic but inseparable old friend. The way it tended to pull slightly to the left on a downward stroke, demanding constant correction, the precise spot on the pommel where the leather wrapping had worn away from years of sweaty, desperate grip, leaving a raw blister if you weren't careful. It wasn't just a sword, it was a catalog of past mistakes and near misses, etched in slightly rusty steel. Keeping it sharp was a constant chore, often involving a whetstone, a lot of elbow grease, and probably a few muttered curses when you sliced your finger for the 10th time that month. Because a dull sword wasn't just inefficient, it was an invitation for your opponent to offer a very pointed critique of your life choices, usually with his much sharper blade. And let's not forget the scabbard, which, in the dust and damp, could either refuse to release the blade in a moment of sheer, pants-wetting panic, or conversely, let it slip out with casual abandon at an inconvenient moment, like during silent prayer, or when you were trying to discreetly relieve yourself behind a bush. Then there's the lance, 10 to 12 feet of solid wood tipped with a pointy bit of iron. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, it was like trying to wield a telegraph pole on horseback, a particularly unwieldy one at that, with a nasty habit of collecting low-hanging branches or the helmets of your fellow riders if you weren't paying attention, In the charge, it was devastating. If you hit your target, and if the lance itself decided to cooperate, miss, or have your horse stumble, and that lance could become an express ticket to A&E, Accident and Emergency, Medieval Edition, consisting mostly of a grim-faced monk with a rusty saw and a limited understanding of the word gentle. Lances had a nasty habit of shattering on impact, sometimes sending splinters into your own face or your horse's. When a lance shattered, it wasn't a clean break. It was an explosion of angry wooden shrapnel, each piece seemingly aimed with malicious intent towards any exposed flesh, particularly your face or hands. Horses, not being fans of sudden wooden shrapnel barrages, often added their own layer of chaos to the situation by trying to bolt, trample anything in their path, or otherwise express their extreme displeasure at your choice of offensive weaponry. Or they'd get stuck, turning you into a very awkward human shish kebab skewer if your opponent's momentum carried him forward, leaving you flailing uselessly as you tried to extricate your primary weapon from someone else's ribcage, and carrying the darn thing when you weren't charging? It was unwieldy, always getting caught on things, and a general pain in the backside, or more accurately, a pain for the poor sod riding behind you who kept getting an impromptu and unwelcome lance point massage in his kidneys. Each lance probably had its own war stories, mostly involving how it tried to trip its owner, unseat him at a particularly inopportune moment, or spontaneously combust out of sheer spite. Okay, maybe not combust, but it probably thought about it. Don't forget the mace or warhammer. For those opponents who foolishly thought plate armor made them invincible, the mace was the Templar's way of saying, "Not so fast, sunshine. Let's see how that fancy helmet handles a direct application of applied physics." A heavy, brutal weapon designed to crush bones and dent helmets with sickening efficiency, it was effective, but also incredibly tiring to swing. Imagine a blacksmith's hammer, but you're trying to wield it accurately from a moving horse. A horse that's probably just as terrified as you are, while someone is actively trying to separate your head from your shoulders. It wasn't a weapon of finesse. It was a weapon of blunt force trauma, exhaustion, and the kind of satisfying thud that meant someone else's day was about to get significantly worse. One missed swing, however, could leave you wide open, overbalanced, and looking rather foolish, just before something sharp and pointy found its way into your vulnerable bits. Or worse, you could accidentally brain your own horse in the confusion, which would be a very unpopular move, both with the rapidly expiring horse and your quartermaster, who would undoubtedly charge you for damages, probably payable in a lifetime of extra latrine duty, and their noble steed, the war horse, a vital piece of knightly equipment, a veritable medieval tank, and often a four-legged sack of neuroses with a mind of its own. These weren't your nimble riding ponies. They were massive, specially bred chargers, trained, in theory, for battle. They were also expensive, high maintenance, and prone to all sorts of equine ailments that no one understood, and for which the only cure was usually either pray harder or try rubbing this suspicious poultice on it. Besides the usual coughs, sprains, and a general tendency to go lame at the worst possible moment, horses were prone to things like the quivering ague, which made them shake like a leaf in a hurricane, or the green slime scours, a particularly pungent and visually alarming affliction that made riding downwind of them an act of true Christian charity and olfactory martyrdom. A Templar might have a deep bond with his horse, a true companion in arms, or he might have Old Bone Shaker, a horse with a gait like a broken cartwheel, and a temperament that swung wildly between suicidal bravery, usually when charging towards something you'd rather avoid, and abject terror, often triggered by a suspicious-looking butterfly or its own shadow. Or the glutton, who would try to eat anything not nailed down, including vital parts of his tack, your bedroll, and occasionally, small, unwary squires. These horses had to carry an armored knight, plus their own barding, armor for horses, which they hated even more than you hated yours, into the terrifying noise and chaos of battle. They suffered horrific injuries, and a knight unhorsed was a knight in serious trouble, A beached turtle in a sea of angry men with sharp objects. They were also targets. Losing your horse in the middle of a fight was like a modern soldier losing his rifle, his ride home, and his best and only non-judgmental friend simultaneously. You loved them. You cursed them. You spent hours grooming them, picking out ticks the size of small grapes, and feeding them the best you could, which often wasn't very good, because your life depended on these four-legged, often unpredictable sacks of muscle and misplaced enthusiasm, and the smell of a large group of war horses, especially in the heat after a long march. Let's just say it was distinctive and pervasive enough to act as its own form of psychological warfare. Navigational instruments? For most Templars on the move, the primary navigational instrument was follow that guy who looks like he knows where he's going, or more often, follow the increasingly irate shouting of the man in charge, who probably also doesn't know where he's going but is very loud about it. Maps were rare, often inaccurate, drawn by monks who thought Jerusalem was just past the next hill in France, and usually guarded jealously by those who could actually read them, or pretend to with convincing authority. The sun, the stars, if you knew them, and it wasn't overcast or a new moon, and local guides of questionable loyalty, who might be leading you to a glorious victory or an easily arranged ambush for a few extra coins, were your mainstays. It's a miracle they ever found their way to the battlefield, let alone back from it. More than one campaign probably got sidetracked by a heated debate over whether that distant smudge was Mount Doom or just a particularly large dung heap. Now, about that shining armor. Oh, it shone all right, especially under the relentless Levantine sun, turning the wearer into a mobile barbecue, a walking advertisement for heat stroke. A full suit of mail, perhaps with some early plate elements, weighed a ton. Or felt like it anyway. Realistically, 40 to 60 pounds of intricately linked iron rings, plus a padded gambeson or accaton worn underneath to prevent chafing and absorb some of the impact. Prevent chafing was a very optimistic term. Wriggling into this medieval straitjacket of iron and padding was a daily wrestling match, often requiring the assistance of a grumbling squire, if you were fancy enough to have one, or a fellow brother, who was probably also grumbling, and a good deal of undignified hopping and muttered oaths. It was like trying to dress an uncooperative, heavily sedated lobster, if the lobster also complained about the fit and the lingering smell of old battles. After a few hours, especially in the heat, that gambeson would be soaked with sweat, breeding its own unique ecosystem of medieval microbes that could probably have applied for their own feudal charter, and the mail would be rubbing you raw in places you didn't even know you had, creating new and exciting constellations of sores. As for your state-of-the-art personal protective equipment, it consisted primarily of this metal mesh onesie, topped with a steel helmet that offered about as much visibility and ventilation as wearing a bucket on your head. A very hot, very heavy bucket. Sure, it could stop a sword cut, mostly unless the swordsman was particularly enthusiastic or lucky, or deflect an arrow, sometimes if it hit just right and wasn't a specially designed armor-piercing one that treated mail like butter. But against a mace, it just spread the impact, meaning instead of a neat hole in you, you got a massive dent in your armor and a collection of impressively bruised or broken bones underneath, like a poorly packaged parcel of pain. Heatstroke was a constant companion, a silent, sweaty assassin. Imagine the joy of being sealed in your own personal oven, the metal heating up, no way to get a breeze, while you're trying to perform strenuous physical activity like, say, fighting for your life, or just trying to walk uphill. It's a wonder more knights didn't just keel over from dehydration and cardiac arrest before the enemy even got close, their last heroic act being a rather pathetic, steamy hiss. And the helmet. Whether it was a simple conical helm with a nasal bar that left your face delightfully exposed to stray arrows and enthusiastic sword wavers, or a more enclosing great helm that turned you into a walking steel drum, it was a claustrophobic, vision-restricting, hearing-muffling metal pot, Peripheral vision? Forget it. You turned your head by turning your whole body, like a very slow, very creaky weather vane. Trying to hear orders over the din of battle inside one of those things was like trying to understand a whispered conversation at a particularly loud heavy metal concert being held inside a tumble dryer. And if you got knocked down, getting back up in all that gear, especially if you were dazed or had just landed in a puddle of something unspeakable, was an adventure in itself, like an overturned turtle trying to right itself, while people are actively trying to poke it with sharp sticks and steal its wallet. More than one Templar, in the heat of battle and the deafening confusion of his bucket-like helm, was rumored to have charged valiantly in the wrong direction, perhaps towards the enemy's baggage train, mistaking it for a strategic objective. Or more embarrassingly, straight into a very surprised and unappreciative clump of thorny bushes he'd mistaken for a wavering enemy line. The bushes rarely pressed charges, but the embarrassment and the scratches lingered. This protection also did very little against the silent killers, disease, infection, and the myriad tiny biting things that saw an armored knight as a walking buffet with convenient gaps in the plating and a warm, sweaty interior. A tiny scratch, if it got infected, and it almost certainly would, given the general lack of hygiene and the abundance of interesting local bacteria, could kill you just as dead as a sword thrust, only much, much slower and more unpleasantly, often involving a lot of pus and a lingering smell that would make even your warhorse edge away. The armor offered zero defense against dysentery, typhus, or the common cold, all of which could incapacitate a warrior far more effectively and with considerably less glory than many weapons. And yet, despite this daily catalog of failings, betrayals, and general discomfort, these tools were your life. You cursed your sword when it stuck. You swore at your horse when it spooked at its own shadow. You muttered imprecations at your armor as it slowly cooked you alive or tried to saw you in half with a rogue rivet. But you also spent hours cleaning that sword, or ordering your non-existent squire to do it, grooming that horse, or at least making sure someone else did, while you supervised from a safe, non-kicking distance, and painstakingly maintaining that armor, because without them, you were just a soft, easily killable bag of flesh and religious zeal. And the religious zeal didn't offer much in the way of deflecting pointy objects. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged in shared misery and mutual grudging respect. You had to trust your equipment, even when it gave you every reason not to, like that time your shield strap snapped mid-charge, or your helmet decided to rotate a full 90 degrees just as you were about to deliver a heroic speech. The meticulous care given to these inanimate objects wasn't about love. It was about survival. A desperate attempt to marginally improve your odds in a game that was clearly rigged against you. Every loose rivet, every dull edge, every frayed strap could be a fatal weakness. An open invitation for the universe to deliver another swift kick to your already tender undercarriage. So, you tended to them. You patched them up with bits of leather and hope. You probably even whispered a prayer over them, or a few choice curses, depending on your mood and how badly they'd let you down recently, hoping they wouldn't choose this particular battle to finally give up the ghost and leave you looking very exposed and very, very stupid. There was a grim intimacy with these objects. You knew every dent in your helmet. That one from the mace at Antioch. That other one from when Brother Geoffrey accidentally dropped his axe on it. Every notch on your blade, a souvenir from a Saracen shield, or perhaps just that time you tried to open a stubborn wine cask with it. The particular way your shield strap chafed your arm into a raw, weeping mess. They were extensions of yourself, albeit extensions that often seemed to have a mind of their own, and usually, that mind was set on making your life just a little bit more difficult, a little bit more painful, or a lot more embarrassing. It was a partnership built not on affection, but on the shared, grim understanding that you were all in this miserable, dangerous business together, until death, or a catastrophic equipment failure, which often led to death, did you part. Living the dream as a Knight Templar wasn't exactly a recipe for a long, healthy, and well-adjusted life. It was more like a speed run through every possible physical ailment and mental anguish medieval society could cook up, with a special crusader-only bonus round of exotic suffering, personally delivered by Satan's angriest mailman. Forget dying gloriously in battle. Your own body and mind were often engaged in a protracted, ugly civil war against your continued existence, a war where both sides were losing badly. By the time our Templar reached what a pampered nobleman back in Europe might consider his vigorous prime, say 30 years old, an age when modern men are just considering taking up artisanal pickling, his body was likely already a creaking, groaning museum of occupational hazards. Think of him not as a shining warrior, but as a walking, talking, though probably mostly groaning, wheezing, and occasionally cursing under his breath, catalog of anatomical complaints, each one a testament to years of questionable life choices, made in the name of God, and a really cool uniform. Let's start from the ground up. His feet, bless their tortured souls, marched for countless miles in ill-fitting leather boots that felt like they were carved from solid oak, or unforgiving iron sabatons that turned every pebble into a personal affront, often wet, rarely clean, and smelling like something had crawled in there to die and then reconsidered. We're talking blisters the size of small birds' eggs that inevitably turned into weeping. Open sores, providing a welcoming entryway for every opportunistic microbe in the Levant. Fungal infections would stage a hostile takeover of his toenails, turning them into grim, blackened, crumbly reminders of past campaigns, each one a tiny, horny monument to neglect. Attempted treatments for these foot-based disasters usually involved questionable poultices made of horse dung, hope, and whatever unidentifiable herbs the local wise woman, or gibbering camp follower, recommended, or simply gritting one's teeth and wrapping the offending appendage in another layer of dirty linen, thereby creating a delightful, mobile petri dish that fostered new and exciting strains of bacteria. Each step on a surprise rock wasn't just painful. It was a personal insult from the very ground he walked on, a reminder that even the earth itself was probably out to get him. Moving up to the legs and knees, carrying all that weight, armor that weighed more than a small peasant, weapons, existential dread, and the crushing burden of everyone else's expectations, put immense strain on the joints. Cartilage would be ground down like grain in a mill, leaving bone to grate on bone with a sound like two skeletons fighting in a biscuit tin. His knees probably sounded like a rusty hinge on a dungeon door every time he bent them, and activities like kneeling for prayer, which was often and lengthy, or getting back on your horse after being unceremoniously dumped off it like a sack of particularly dense turnips, became Herculean tasks, accompanied by a symphony of pops, crackles, and muffled swearing. Varicose veins, like angry purple rivers trying to escape his flesh, would be mapping out new and increasingly terrifying trade routes across his calves. Then there's the back. Oh, the noble Templar spine. After years of awkward postures in the saddle, because warhorses rarely came with lumbar support, sleeping on hard, unforgiving ground that seemed to actively suck the warmth from your body, lifting heavy objects like fallen comrades, inconveniently large rocks for castle walls, or just his own damn helmet after a long day, and absorbing the shock of combat, which felt like being repeatedly hit by a very enthusiastic blacksmith. His spine likely resembled a question mark that had been through a very bad argument with a trebuchet. Slipped discs were probably handed out as party favors. Chronic lower back pain that radiated pure, unadulterated misery down his legs was a constant companion, a dull, throbbing reminder of every bad decision he'd ever made. He probably had the posture of a disgruntled gargoyle by his mid-30s, a posture that made simple things like picking up a dropped gauntlet an exercise in strategic bending, suppressed groans, and a silent prayer that he wouldn't get stuck halfway. This gargoyle chic often required several attempts to retrieve said gauntlet, and occasionally elicited the unsolicited, unhelpful advice of younger, still annoyingly flexible brothers who'd helpfully point out he was doing it all wrong. His hands and arms, magnificent ruined things, gnarled and scarred like the branches of a very old, very angry tree, constantly gripping sword hilts, often slick with sweat or worse, lance shafts, or the reins of a horse that was actively trying to dislodge him, had to lead to some serious repetitive strain injuries before such a concept even existed. Calluses thick as old leather covered his palms, occasionally cracking open just for fun. Scarred knuckles from ill-judged punches and tavern brawls. Before he took his vows, of course, mostly. Or the brutal intimacy of close-quarters combat. And the joints in his fingers and wrists screamed in protest with every movement, often waking him with his fingers so stiff he couldn't make a fist. Arthritis wasn't a matter of if, but when. And it would turn the simple act of buckling his armor, or trying to manipulate a piece of that rock-hard bread into his mouth, into a 10-minute ordeal of muttered curses and gritted teeth. He'd have the grip strength of a depressed eagle when he needed it, but the fine motor skills of someone wearing 3 pairs of oversized medieval mittens when trying to do anything delicate, like, say, not spilling his wine. Breakfast was often a race against his own rebellious anatomy. Let's not forget the hernias. All that straining and lifting, often done incorrectly, because who had time for proper technique when a Saracen with a very large scimitar was charging at you? Made a Templar a prime candidate for his insides trying to become his outsides. Groin, abdomen. Bits of him would decide they'd had enough of the internal arrangements and attempt a daring escape. This wasn't just painful. It was potentially deadly if things got twisted or infected. And the medieval cure for a hernia? Probably involved a lot of optimistic poking by someone whose primary medical qualification was owning a sharp knife. This cure might involve the local farrier, who normally dealt with stubborn mules and possessed a similar bedside manner for humans, applying his professional skills with a concerning level of enthusiasm. Or perhaps a truss made of old leather, bits of wood, and pure, unadulterated optimism, which did little to contain the actual problem, but provided an excellent new source of chafing and public humiliation. His skin? A veritable roadmap of suffering, a Jackson Pollock painting of misery rendered in shades of red, purple, and angry beige. Sunburn so severe it blistered and peeled, revealing new, angrier skin underneath that was just waiting for its turn to be immolated. Windburn that left his face feeling like he'd tried to shave with a particularly coarse brick. Patches of eczema from the constant irritation of rough wool, sweat, and the kind of dirt that had its own ancestral lineage. Boils, cysts, and other delightful eruptions brought on by filth, stress, and a diet that was probably 90% beige and 10% regret, and scars, of course. Not just the big heroic ones from sword fights that he could lie about later, but the little nagging ones from daily life. Nicks from trying to shave with a less than sharp knife by the light of a flickering tallow candle. Burns from cooking fires that always seemed to have a personal vendetta against his eyebrows. Mysterious rashes from poisonous plants he'd accidentally slept on because everything in the Holy Land seemed to be either sharp, poisonous, or actively trying to kill you. His eyes? Strained from squinting into the desert sun, which felt like staring into the devil's own blast furnace, constantly scanning for enemies that often turned out to be heat shimmer or particularly shifty-looking goats, prone to infections from dust, flies, which seemed to view eyeballs as prime landing strips and or latrines, and the regrettable habit of rubbing them with filthy, gauntleted hands. Conditions like trachoma, a nasty bacterial infection, could turn the world into a gritty, painful blur, where distinguishing friend from foe at 50 paces was an act of faith rather than sight, and reading the fine print on your eternal salvation contract or the camp roster for latrine duty was entirely out of the question. Good luck aiming your lance if the world was just a painful, watery smear. Night vision, after staring at smoky campfires for hours on end, then trying to pierce the inky blackness of a desert night. It was probably shot to hell, leaving him to navigate by bumping into things and hoping they weren't hostile. And his teeth. Oh, the dental horrors. With a diet heavy on coarse bread, often with added grit from millstones, because why not add a bit of internal abrasion to your meal? And a distinct lack of anything resembling dental hygiene, beyond perhaps a twig if he was feeling fancy, or a quick swill of sour wine. His mouth was likely a war zone, a biological weapons facility of terrifying proportions. Cracked teeth from unexpected rocks in the bread, rampant decay that tunneled through enamel like a determined sapper, gum disease that would make your eyes water from 10 paces, and breath that could stun a warhorse, fell a small bird from a tree, or possibly be weaponized in a siege. A toothache wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a debilitating, mind-numbing agony that could drive a man to madness, with the only cure being a brutal, unanesthetized extraction by the company barber surgeon. This worthy, often the same fellow who cut hair and occasionally performed minor amputations, armed with a pair of rusty pliers that looked suspiciously like they'd recently been used to unshoe a particularly stubborn donkey, would offer a swig of cheap wine for courage, his, not yours, a quick prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of toothache sufferers who was clearly overworked in this period, and then a whole lot of yanking, twisting, and cracking. Smiling was probably something he tried to avoid, for everyone's sake, especially his own. All this contributed to premature aging that was less graceful silver fox and more startlingly well-preserved bog body. A Templar of 35 might look 50 or 60 if he'd had a particularly rough couple of decades. His hair, if not lost to genetics, stress, or a bad helmet-fitting incident, would be thinning and gray. His face, a mass of wrinkles etched by sun, worry, and chronic pain, looked like a map of every bad road he'd ever traveled. His body, though perhaps still strong in a wiry, don't-mess-with-me kind of way, would be a patchwork of old injuries, chronic conditions, and a general air of being thoroughly used up. He was old before his time, a man whose youth had been sacrificed on the altar of constant hardship and questionable strategic decisions. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the slow decay of the musculoskeletal system that got you. Oh no, the lifestyle of a crusading Templar was a golden invitation, a gilded RSVP for a host of fascinating internal afflictions. The kind of enemies that armor and a sharp sword were absolutely useless against, and which often had much more creative ways of making your life a living hell. First and foremost, let's talk about dysentery, aka the bloody flux, the screaming shits, or as some Templars probably called it, Tuesday. This was the bane of every army camp since time immemorial, the great equalizer that laid low knights and squires alike, caused by a delightful cocktail of bacteria or amoebas lurking in contaminated food and water. And let's be honest, all food and water in a medieval camp was a suspect until proven innocent and usually proven guilty shortly thereafter. Dysentery turned your insides into a churning, cramping, liquid-expelling nightmare. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was dehydrating, weakening, and often fatal, as you slowly but surely emptied yourself of every vital fluid. Imagine trying to fight in armor, or even just stand upright for morning prayers, when you can't trust your own bowels further than you can spit, and every sudden movement feels like a high-stakes gamble with your dignity. The pristine white surcoat of the Templars, symbol of purity and devotion. Let's just say it presented challenges, and often became a rather unfortunate and very public, multi-toned record of a knight's losing battle with his own digestive tract. Strategic positioning during chapter meetings, a talent for blaming nearby farm animals, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every secluded bush within a 5-mile radius became highly developed, if rarely acknowledged, Templar skills. Then there were the fevers. A medieval camp was a smorgasbord for fever-inducing illnesses. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes breeding in any stagnant water they could find, and there was plenty, would bring on cycles of bone-shaking chills that made your teeth chatter like castanets, followed by burning, delirious fever that made the desert sun feel like a cool compress. Typhus, affectionately known as camp fever, and spread by the ubiquitous lice, of which there was no shortage, each Templar hosting a thriving, multi-generational community, was another swift and brutal killer, bringing rashes, delirium, a splitting headache, and often a swift exit into the next world. Just a fever could mean anything, and none of it was good. The cure? Oh, the cures were almost as bad as the diseases. Bleeding, based on the idea of releasing the bad humors, often just released what little strength you had left, leaving you feeling like a deflated wineskin with a headache. Being bled involved having a vein, often in the arm, opened with a fleam or lancet, and a prescribed amount of precious blood drained into a bowl, all while you were already weak and probably terrified. Purging was even more delightful, involving concoctions of herbs and other mystery ingredients designed to make you expel the contents of your stomach and bowels with volcanic, explosive enthusiasm. This process rarely cured the illness, but certainly made you wish you were already dead, or at least unconscious. And of course, prayers, which were always on offer, but seemed to have a variable success rate when faced with a really determined bacterium. Respiratory problems were also rife, a constant wheezing soundtrack to camp life. All that dust inhaled on the march or during sieges, where the air was thick with pulverized stone and probably less savory things. The acrid smoke from countless campfires burning green wood or dried dung, sleeping in damp, crowded conditions that were basically petri dishes for lung infections. It was a recipe for chronic bronchitis, pneumonia that felt like drowning on dry land, or even tuberculosis, the consumption that slowly ate you away from the inside. A hacking cough wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a sign that your lungs were losing their own private bloody war, trying to hold a shield wall or bellow a battle cry, while in the grip of a coughing fit that threatens to turn you inside out and display your internal organs to the enemy. Not ideal for morale, yours or anyone else's. And let's not forget the joys of chronic malnutrition and dehydration. Supplies were often scarce, unreliable, and what they got was rarely what you'd call a balanced diet, unless balanced meant an equal measure of weevils in every biscuit. Army bread, which could also serve as a handy bludgeon, and salted meat, if they were lucky, and if the salt hadn't entirely mummified it into something inedible, didn't provide a lot of vitamins. Scurvy, with its delightful symptoms of bleeding, spongy gums, loose teeth that felt like they were about to abandon ship, reopening old wounds that you thought had healed years ago, and profound lethargy, wasn't just for sailors on long voyages. It was an equal opportunity afflictor of land-bound armies too. The visual horror of watching your own body seemingly start to decompose while you were still in it was a special kind of psychological torment. Dehydration in the desert heat was a constant, insidious threat, leading to confusion, weakness, agonizing kidney stones that felt like passing a collection of angry hedgehogs, and eventually, collapse and a rather unpleasant death. The level of profound, bone-deep exhaustion that sleep barely dented, that left you feeling like your skeleton was made of lead and your brain was full of wet sand, was their constant companion. They were running on fumes, held together by stubbornness, religious fervor, and the fear of what would happen if they stopped. Parasites? Don't even get me started. It was practically a party in your pants, and everyone was invited. Worms of various unpleasant persuasions, roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, each more disgusting than the last, were almost certainly a given, taking up residence in your intestines and cheerfully sharing your meager rations from the inside. The ungrateful little passengers. You could sometimes feel them moving. Let that sink in. Skin parasites like scabies, caused by mites burrowing under your skin to lay their eggs, would have turned their nights and days into an itchy, maddening torment, leading to frantic scratching that only made things worse. Living in close quarters with animals, other equally infested humans, and a general disregard for what we'd now call basic hygiene made you a walking, talking, scratching ecosystem, a veritable Noah's Ark of tiny, unwelcome guests. While his body was engaged in a constant, losing battle against a coalition of external forces and internal betrayals, our Templar's mind was fighting its own silent, desperate war. The psychological toll of this life was immense, a slow grinding down of the human spirit, like water dripping on a stone, if the water was made of fear and the stone was your sanity. There was the ever-present hum of low-grade fear and anxiety, the background static to their existence. The threat of ambush on the march, every shadowed ravine or distant cloud of dust, a potential harbinger of doom. The visceral terror of a full-scale battle, the roar of voices, the clang of steel, the screams of the wounded, the smell of blood and fear, the gnawing uncertainty of sieges, wondering if today was the day the walls would be breached or the food would finally run out, the constant intimate knowledge that a painful, messy death could come at any moment, from any direction, an arrow from a hidden bowman, a sword thrust in the chaos, a rock dropped from a castle wall, or from within your own sickened body. This wasn't the adrenaline rush of a single heroic moment that you could tell stories about later. It was a chronic, gnawing dread that lived in the pit of your stomach like a cold, undigested stone and whispered unsettling things in the quiet, lonely hours of guard duty. Sleep would offer little respite, often filled with nightmares replaying the horrors witnessed or imagining those yet to come, leaving him to wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, the phantom screams still echoing in his ears. This constant dread wasn't just a mental state. It was physical. A permanently clenched jaw, a knot in the stomach that no amount of terrible food could loosen, hands that trembled slightly even when at rest, a tendency to jump at loud noises like a startled cat. It was the background hum to every waking moment, and often the star of every nightmare. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony. When not punctuated by moments of abject terror, life could be incredibly, stupefyingly dull. The same prayers, recited by rote until the words lost all meaning. The same drills, practiced until your muscles screamed in protest and your mind went numb. The same bad food, served with the same lack of imagination. The same uncomfortable bed, in the same smelly, crowded barracks or windswept patch of dirt, day after day, week after week, sometimes year after year, far from anything resembling home or comfort. The landscape might change from dusty brown to rocky brown, to occasionally, if they were unlucky, swampy green. But the essential nature of the suffering often remained depressingly, relentlessly constant. Variety meant the dysentery was a slightly different color today, or the sergeant found a new and interesting way to insult your parentage during weapons practice. Monday. Pray, drill, sweat, eat gruel that tastes like despair, patrol the same damn stretch of hostile nothingness, sweat some more, get yelled at, pray, try to sleep while brother snoring loudly enough to wake the dead next to you does his best impression of a congested walrus. Tuesday. Pray, sweat, patrol a different stretch of equally hostile nothingness, innovation. Eat gruel that tastes suspiciously like Monday's despair, but with more lumps. Drill until your eyeballs ache. Sweat, get yelled at for sweating too much. Or not enough, it was hard to tell. Pray. Wednesday was exciting muck out the stables day. A fragrant festival of backbreaking labor, followed by, you guessed it, prayer, sweat, and a profound yearning for Thursday to be magically canceled by a localized apocalypse that only affected the stables. This kind of boredom, this endless repetition of discomfort and drudgery, can be as corrosive to the soul as outright fear, hollowing you out from the inside until all that's left is a weary shell. A profound lack of agency and dehumanization also played its part. A Templar, especially a rank-and-file brother, was a cog in a vast, often impersonal machine. He went where he was told, fought when he was told, ate what he was given, and was expected to be grateful for it no matter how foul, and endured what he was forced to endure, usually without question, because questions often led to more latrine duty or an intimate acquaintance with a disciplinary scourge. His personal desires, his comfort, his very individuality were often suppressed, systematically dismantled in the name of the order, the rule, and the ever-elusive mission. This could lead to a sense of detachment, a feeling of being an object rather than a person, a disposable tool in a larger, often incomprehensible game played by kings, popes, and grand masters who rarely shared his accommodations or his dysentery. He was a sword to be wielded, a shield to be broken, a body to fill a gap in the line. Isolation was another insidious factor. Even surrounded by his brothers in arms, a Templar could feel profoundly, achingly alone. He was far from his original home, his family, his culture, everything that had once been familiar and comforting. Letters, if they ever arrived, were rare, unreliable, and often months out of date, like ghostly whispers from a life that no longer seemed real. While the bonds of brotherhood could be strong, forged in the crucible of shared suffering, the unique internal landscape of one's own fear, pain, doubt, and homesickness was a solitary, often bleak place. Who could he confess his deepest terrors or his crumbling faith to in an order that prized unwavering courage and unquestioning belief? The erosion of spirit was perhaps the most insidious toll, the slow, creeping rust that attacked the soul. How long could one maintain fervent religious zeal? The bright, burning fire of idealism that had perhaps brought him to the order in the first place, when surrounded by so much brutality, suffering, hypocrisy, and the often very unchristian behavior of his fellow crusaders, and sometimes, in moments of desperation or rage, himself. Cynicism, that bitter weed, could easily take root and flourish in such fertile ground. The initial noble ideals, protecting the innocent, fighting for God's kingdom on earth, might tarnish, crack, and eventually crumble, replaced by a grim pragmatism, a weary resignation, or even a bitter, corrosive resentment. What was it all for? Was this endless cycle of violence and misery, this mountain of skulls and suffering, truly God's will? Or just the bloody, pointless ambition of flawed, greedy men hiding behind sacred banners? These were dangerous questions, the kind best left unasked. But they likely festered in the quiet darkness of many a Templar's heart. Coping mechanisms, such as they were often rough, ready, and probably not endorsed by the rule. Gallows humor, a dark and bitter wit shared among comrades who understood the absurdity of their situation, was likely a common way to deflect the horror and maintain a sliver of sanity. Their jokes were blacker than a sealed tomb on a moonless night, often revolving around death, dismemberment, and the general awfulness of their superiors. Hear about Brother Thomas? Took an arrow to the knee. An arrow to the knee? Terrible luck. Now he'll only be able to complain about his other knee and how much better the arrows were in his day. Laughter was a harsh barking sound, less about joy and more about defiance against the overwhelming, crushing weight of it all. Fatalism, a belief that your fate was sealed, that your death was already written in God's great ledger. So why worry? Might have brought a strange sort of peace, or at least a reckless abandon, to some. Others might have thrown themselves even more fervently into their religious duties, seeking solace and meaning in the familiar rituals and prayers, a spiritual shield against the encroaching darkness. And some, undoubtedly, just broke, became withdrawn, overly aggressive, haunted by visions, or simply lost their minds in a world that seemed designed to crush them, their sanity shattering like a poorly made clay pot. His inner world likely became a fortress of stoic resignation, its walls built of scar tissue and cynicism, punctuated by flashes of impotent anger or a bleak, weary cynicism that passed for wisdom. He was a professional sufferer, an expert in enduring the unendurable, because the alternative was to simply lie down and die. And that wasn't the Templar way. Not until they'd squeezed every last drop of misery and service out of you anyway. Travel and warfare rarely happen in a blissful vacuum of solitude. Oh no, there are always people. And in the 12th or 13th century Levant, these people, whether they were your superiors, your supposed allies, the locals, or even your own brothers in arms, often had a remarkable talent for cranking up the succometer to 11. While the Templars were a powerful order, they still answered to people, or at least had to deal with individuals whose agendas could make a simple task feel like navigating a viper pit blindfolded. First up, you had your esteemed ecclesiastical superiors. These were the bishops, legates, or visiting church dignitaries who might turn up expecting 5-star treatment in a desert war zone. Think of a portly, perfumed prelate complaining about the quality of the wine, when there was any, the heat, as if the Templars controlled the sun, and the general lack of deference from men who were too busy trying not to die to observe every nicety of church protocol. Brother Knight, your armor appears somewhat tarnished. And is that blood on your mantle? Most unseemly. Do see to it before Vespers, there's a good chap. Their demands for comfort and ceremony in the midst of squalor and imminent peril were a special kind of torment, adding an extra layer of farcical stress to an already overburdened Templar. These were men who believed their holy pronouncements could stop arrows, and were often genuinely surprised when they didn't. Then there were the visiting nobles and royal agents. These fine fellows, often dripping with arrogance and silks unsuited for the climate, would arrive with grand, impractical plans, expecting the battle-hardened Templars to be their personal honor guard or shock troops for some ill-conceived siege. They'd question tactics, demand instant results, and generally treat the Templars like hired help with swords. Imagine a prissy duke's third cousin, who's never seen a battle outside of a poorly written poem, telling a veteran Templar sergeant how to conduct a patrol. I say, good man, shouldn't you be charging more? Heroically. My great-aunt Matilda's tapestries always show more elan. The level of eye-rolling this must have induced could probably have generated its own small sandstorm. Their entourages were often worse, sycophantic minions aping their master's arrogance, getting in the way and consuming precious resources. Let's not forget the merchants and shippers if the Templars were escorting caravans or guarding trade routes, a task they sometimes undertook for revenue. Some of these individuals viewed the Templars less as holy warriors and more as heavily armed security guards with an inconvenient prayer schedule. They'd be constantly fretting about their goods, trying to haggle down protection fees, as if the Templars were running a medieval bargain basement, and complaining if a single bolt of silk got dusty. That bandit raid was most inconvenient. My profits for this quarter will be slightly diminished. Can't you Templars control your local ruffians a bit better? What are we even paying you for? Usually screamed from a safe distance after the Templars had just finished risking their lives to save his miserable cargo. And within the order itself, while discipline was paramount, you still had your brutal overseers or commanders. Not every Templar marshal or preceptor was a kindly father figure. Some were hard, demanding men, driven by ambition or a sadistic streak, who saw their subordinates as expendable tools to achieve military objectives. These were the types who'd order a suicidal charge just before dinner, or mete out harsh punishments for minor infractions, believing that fear was the best motivator. Their qualifications for leadership often seemed to be an inability to smile, and an intimate, almost loving relationship with the concept of endless, pointless drills. They were the bosses from hell, medieval edition, whose arrival would make your stomach clench and your desire to be suddenly, violently ill skyrocket. Did anyone ever say, "Well done, Brother Godfrey, for not only surviving that ambush but also for managing to keep your entrails on the inside? Jolly good show." Unlikely. Gratitude was a foreign currency, rarely imported into the war-torn Holy Land. Competence was expected. Failure was punished, often severely. Success in a skirmish simply meant you lived to face the next, probably worse, skirmish. Averting disaster through skill and courage didn't earn you a bonus. It just reset the clock until the next potential disaster. Your reward for risking life and limb, for enduring sickness, filth, and constant danger, was generally the continuation of your miserable existence. Plus, maybe an extra bread ration, if the quartermaster was feeling generous. He usually wasn't. You weren't seen as a skilled individual with unique talents and a breaking point. You were a renewable resource, a white-mantled cog in God's great grinding war machine. If you broke, you were replaced. If you died, there'd be a brief prayer. Your meager belongings would be absorbed by the order, and life, such as it was, would go on without missing a beat. This lack of recognition, this sense of being utterly expendable, could be profoundly demoralizing. You could pour your heart, soul, and considerable martial skill into your duties, only to be met with indifference or criticism from those in command, or those you were nominally protecting. The pilgrims you were guarding arrived safely? Well, that's your job, isn't it? Don't expect a fruit basket. It fostered a grim sort of pragmatism. You fought for your brothers beside you, for your own survival, and for your faith, because you certainly weren't fighting for the applause. And what about your comrades, your fellow Templars? Surely in this shared crucible of suffering, unbreakable bonds of brotherhood were forged, right? Well, yes and no. It was complicated. On the one hand, the man fighting beside you, the one whose shield covered your flank, the one who'd drag you back if you fell, these were your brothers in a way no civilian could ever understand. You ate the same wretched food, endured the same scorching sun, faced the same terrifying enemies. This shared experience bred a unique, often unspoken camaraderie. Laughter, when it occurred, was a harsh, barking sound, usually at something incredibly grim or absurd that only another Templar would find funny. A shared glance over a particularly idiotic order from a clueless superior could speak volumes. Small acts of solidarity, sharing a water skin, helping with armor, standing an extra watch for a sick comrade. These were the glue that held units together. However, constant privation, fear, and the brutalizing nature of their existence could also turn men inward, or against each other, cram hundreds of stressed, armed, and often unwell men into a confined space like a castle or a marching column, and tempers were bound to fray. Rivalries could fester, especially between knights from different regions or social standings before they joined. Grudges over perceived slights, stolen bits of food, or accusations of cowardice could simmer beneath the surface, sometimes erupting into ugly brawls that the commanders would have to brutally suppress. There was an unspoken pecking order, often based on veteran status, fighting prowess, or sheer intimidating presence. New recruits, the probationers, were at the bottom, often getting the worst duties and the brunt of any bad moods. Trust was hard-earned and easily lost. A moment of hesitation in battle, a careless word, could mark you. And then there was the problem of differing levels of zeal. You might have the genuinely pious knight bunking next to a cynical old veteran who'd seen too much, or a reluctant recruit who was only there because his family wanted him out of the way. These different attitudes could clash, creating friction. The devout might see the cynic's dark jokes as sacrilegious, while the veteran might view the newcomer's enthusiasm as dangerously naive. Mostly, though, it was a collective endurance. You might not like everyone you served with. You might actively despise the snoring of the knight in the bunk next to you, or the way another brother always seemed to avoid the truly unpleasant chores. But you were all in the same leaking, overloaded boat in the middle of a stormy sea. You relied on each other, not necessarily out of affection, but out of grim necessity. They were the only other people who understood. even partially, the particular brand of organized lunacy that was a Templar's life. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it really wasn't. So, other people were definitely not a reliable source of comfort or joy. Often, quite the opposite. If you were hoping that the Templar life compensated for its constant danger and toil with five-star accommodations and gourmet dining, I regret to inform you that you've stumbled into the wrong historical narrative. The concept of luxury for a crusading Knight Templar was so laughably inadequate, it circled right back around to being just another form of inventive torment. Dining as a Knight Templar was an experience best forgotten, or at least best not described, right before you're about to eat your own dinner. The Templar rule was pretty clear on diet. It was to be simple, communal, and designed for sustenance, not pleasure. They hit the simple part out of the park. Sustenance was debatable, and pleasure had clearly been excommunicated. The staple of this delightful culinary journey was bread. Not your fluffy artisanal sourdough, mind you. We're talking dense, coarse, often gritty cakes of dubious flour content that could have doubled as shield bosses or emergency doorstops. It was the kind of bread that, after a day or two in the desert heat, developed the texture of ancient sandal leather and tasted progressively more like compacted sawdust. Sometimes, if the local harvest was particularly dire or the supply lines were having a bad millennium, it might contain interesting textural additions like weevils, extra protein, or small pebbles, good for the digestion, probably. You didn't so much eat it as engage in a prolonged wrestling match with it, a match your teeth often lost. To accompany this majestic bread, you might get onions. Raw onions, because nothing says bon appetit like the lingering aroma of raw onion on your breath mingling with the scent of stale sweat and fear. Maybe a few sad-looking vegetables if they were garrisoned somewhere with a garden, probably boiled into a flavorless mush that made you question the point of vegetables in the first place. Think limp carrots, suspicious greens, and the occasional turnip that tasted mainly of disappointment. For protein, if the stars aligned and the quartermaster wasn't selling it off for a profit, there might be dried or salted meat or fish. Dried was the operative word here, as in, so desiccated it could absorb all the moisture from your body just by looking at it. Salted meat was often so aggressively preserved it was practically inedible without days of soaking, a luxury they rarely had time for. So, you'd gnaw on these leather-like strips, extracting a few calories and a lifetime supply of sodium. The fish often had the added bonus of smelling like it had died of profound regret several weeks before being caught. On feast days, which were few and far between, they might get fresh meat. But fresh in a medieval camp often meant killed this morning, already attracting flies. And to wash this all down? Water, straight from the generous, if bacterially adventurous, local well, river, or cistern. Often lukewarm, frequently tasting of mud, algae, or the faint but unmistakable tang of something upstream probably died in this. Contamination was a given. This wasn't Evian, folks. This was water that viewed your intestines as a new and exciting frontier for microbial colonization. Sometimes there was weak beer or sour wine, which was often safer than the water due to the fermentation process. But safer didn't mean pleasant. The beer was often thin and watery, the wine acidic enough to strip paint. But hey, at least it had a mild alcoholic kick, which might briefly make you forget you were about to eat more rock bread. The conditions under which this food was prepared and consumed would make a modern health inspector spontaneously combust. Open fires, dusty environments, flies treating every surface as a public lavatory, and cooks whose understanding of hygiene was probably as rudimentary as their understanding of seasoning. Eating was often done in shifts, quickly and without much ceremony, because there was always praying to do, or fighting, or dying. It wasn't designed to fuel a warrior. It was designed to barely keep a serf from collapsing. The fact that these men fought at all on such a diet is a testament to human stubbornness, or perhaps just profound, hunger-induced delirium. After a long day of nearly dying, what could be better than retiring to your luxurious private chambers? Except luxurious private chambers usually meant a patch of hard ground or a sliver of wooden plank in a crowded, drafty barracks. Your sleeping quarters, if you were lucky enough to be in a castle or commandery, were likely a communal affair. Think long rooms filled with wooden bunks, or simply straw palliasses laid out on the floor. Privacy was a concept as alien as a day off or a decent dental plan. You'd be packed in like salted fish in a barrel, surrounded by the symphony of snores, coughs, groans, and the occasional nightmare-fueled shout from your exhausted brethren. The air would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, old straw, and lingering despair. If you were on campaign, shelter was an even more optimistic term. It might be a hastily erected tent, offering minimal protection from the elements and absolutely none from the local insect population. Or more often, it was simply wherever you dropped at the end of the march, perhaps huddled under your cloak, with the cold, damp earth seeping into your bones, or the hot sand trying to become an integral part of your being. Exposure to the chilling night air, the scorching sun if you were caught without shade, or a sudden downpour that soaked you to the core was just part of the package. And the roommates? Oh, the delightful, uninvited roommates. We're talking mosquitoes, fleas, lice, and rats. Your bedroll was their kingdom. You'd spend half the night scratching, swatting, and feeling tiny things scurry over you. Lice were a particular scourge in communal living, happily hopping from one warm body to the next, spreading itchiness and disease with cheerful abandon. Rats, bold as brass, would skitter through the darkness, looking for scraps of food, or perhaps a sleeping Templar's toe to nibble on. It was less a room of one's own, and more a shared hovel with several hundred of your closest and itchiest acquaintances, both human and otherwise. Hygiene in these sleeping quarters? Let's just say the concept of changing the sheets hadn't really caught on, especially when the sheets were a pile of flea-infested straw. The notion that night was for uninterrupted sleep was a charming fairy tale told in some other, more fortunate part of the world. For a Knight Templar, sleep was a battered, bruised, and frequently interrupted acquaintance. If you weren't jolted awake by the agonizing throb of your protesting muscles, or the desperate need to scratch an itch that felt like it was located somewhere deep inside your bones, there were plenty of other diversions. Someone always had to stand watch. That meant hours spent peering into the oppressive darkness. Every rustle of leaves or distant animal cry a potential sign of imminent pointy death. Even when it wasn't your turn, the changing of the guard, the passwords whispered in the dark, the clank of armor as men moved about, all conspired to keep you hovering in that miserable twilight between exhaustion and true rest. Then there were the emergency tasks. A sudden alarm in the night. Enemy at the walls. Or the latrine trench has collapsed again. Would have you scrambling for your gear, heart pounding, adrenaline dumping into your system, any hope of sleep instantly obliterated. Even on a peaceful night, there might be duties like bailing water if you were on a ship, because medieval ships were basically sieves with sails, or tending to sick animals, or just being called upon because some officer couldn't sleep and decided everyone else should share his misery. The sheer physical discomfort often made deep sleep impossible. Lying on hard, uneven ground, with rocks digging into your back, your armor still on or piled uncomfortably beside you. The oppressive heat of a summer night in the Levant, or the bone-chilling cold of winter. The constant drone of insects, the noises of the camp, the smell. It all added up to a recipe for chronic sleep deprivation. Deep, restorative slumber was a rare and precious commodity, hoarded like gold. Most Templars probably operated in a state of perpetual near-exhaustion, their eyelids heavy, their minds foggy, their reaction times dulled. It's a miracle they could even swing a sword, let alone fight complex battles, when they were probably dreaming of nothing more than 5 uninterrupted minutes on a soft mattress. The only time they likely got anything approaching a deep sleep was when they finally succumbed to illness or injury, and even then, it was probably a feverish, nightmare-ridden affair. Sleep wasn't a refuge, it was just a less active form of suffering. So, you've sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty is the key word here when we discuss a Templar's personal financial portfolio, which was generally as empty as a hermit's address book. While the Templar order itself became incredibly wealthy, controlling vast estates, castles, and even engaging in early forms of banking, this corporate wealth did not translate into individual riches for Brother Reginald poverty-stricken. His was a life of institutional provision, not personal profit. The concept of a regular payday involving clinking coins dropping into a Templar's personal pouch was, for most of these warrior monks, a delightful fiction. As a member of a monastic order, a Templar had technically renounced personal possessions. His wages usually arrived in the form of, well, continued existence, such as it was. This meant rations, a measure of that delightful rock-like bread, perhaps a small allotment of beans or peas that tasted suspiciously like despair, and if the saints were smiling, a bit of cheese that hadn't yet achieved sentience. This wasn't exactly a king's ransom. It was calculated with grim precision to be just about enough to keep you from inconveniently dying of starvation, and thus ceasing to be a useful, sword-swinging asset. The quality and quantity of these rations could fluctuate wildly. A successful raid or a newly arrived supply ship might mean a temporary upgrade from utterly wretched to merely aggressively mediocre. But a long siege, a bad harvest, or simple logistical incompetence, a common medieval ailment, could see those meager rations dwindle to near starvation levels. Consistency was not a word in their culinary vocabulary, unless it was consistently disappointing. And deductions. Oh, the creative accounting that could occur even in a non-monetary system. While a Templar wasn't fined in coin, he could certainly find his already pitiful share of food or supplies reduced for perceived laziness, losing equipment, even if it was lost because it disintegrated from sheer age and overuse, or insubordination, like, say, wincing too obviously when an officer announced yet another pointless drill in the midday sun. It was a system designed to keep you humble, or at least too weak from hunger to complain too loudly. Brother Bartholomew, it appears your lance was shattered in that last unfortunate encounter with the enemy's skull. Most careless. Your bread ration shall be halved until you learn to respect the order's property. Any actual coin a Templar might have possessed upon entering the order was supposed to be surrendered to the common treasury. If gifts were given to him personally, they too were to be handed over. He was, in essence, a corporate asset, fed and kitted out by the corporation, but with no personal stock options or bonuses, unless you count not being flogged today as a performance incentive. Here lies one of history's grand cosmic ironies. The Knights Templar, as an organization, became a massive economic powerhouse. They were vital to the defense of the Crusader states, provided essential services like protecting pilgrims, for a fee often, and even facilitated massive financial transactions across Europe and the Holy Land, acting as proto-bankers for kings and nobles. They were, in many ways, the armored backbone of the whole Crusader enterprise. And what was the individual Templar's share in this vast wealth he helped protect and generate? His daily bread, if you could call it that, his rough woolen tunic, his second-hand armor, and a place on the floor to sleep. He was the lifeblood of a system that kept him perpetually impoverished. He might be guarding a caravan laden with silks, spices, and gold that could fund a small kingdom, yet his own pockets would contain nothing but lint, pious thoughts, and shattered dreams of a decent meal. His social status was complicated. As a Knight Templar, he was part of an elite respected and often feared order. But as an individual, he was a man sworn to poverty, a servant of the order. He wielded immense de facto power with his sword and his disciplined brothers, yet he owned nothing. He moved mountains of wealth, secured trade routes that enriched kings, and defended castles that were symbols of Christian power. Yet his personal reward was spiritual, with the earthly compensation package being decidedly underwhelming. You were a vital cog, yes, but cogs don't get profit sharing. They just get grease. And not even good grease, probably rancid animal fat. Our Templars' already precarious economic non-existence was further buffeted by the whims of gods, kings, and the general chaos of the medieval world. A good harvest back in Europe, or in the patches of land the Crusader states controlled, might mean more supplies were available somewhere, but it didn't guarantee they'd reach Brother Grimly staring at a wormy biscuit in his isolated desert outpost. More likely, it meant more campaigning was possible, so more marching, more fighting, and more opportunities to get yourself killed, all on the same basic miserable rations. A bad harvest or a famine? That was a disaster. Food prices, not that he was buying, but the order was, would skyrocket. Supplies would dry up, rations would be cut. Men would grow weaker, more susceptible to disease, and less effective in combat. Sieges became even more hellish, with starvation staring you in the face from both inside and outside the walls. Then there were the grand ideas of kings and popes. A new crusade called? That meant a massive influx of new recruits, often ill-prepared and poorly disciplined, straining the already stretched resources of the Templars in the East. It meant new campaigns, new political squabbles between egotistical leaders, and usually, new levels of logistical nightmares. Your Templar might find himself diverted to support some princeling's harebrained scheme to capture a castle that had no strategic value but looked nice on a map, all while his own fortress was running out of arrows and enthusiasm. War and unrest, which were the Templars' bread and butter, so to speak, if the bread wasn't made of actual stone, also had a direct impact. A major defeat meant loss of territory, loss of revenue-generating estates for the order, and a general increase in misery for everyone. A victory might bring plunder, but that usually went into the order's coffers, not into the pockets of the men who'd done the bleeding. Their main dividend from victory was usually just the chance to do it all over again, somewhere else. So financially, our Templar was out of luck. He was a warrior monk in a system that valued his sword arm far more than his personal well-being, existing on a shoestring budget provided by an immensely wealthy organization that preached the virtues of poverty, at least for its rank and file. He wasn't in it for the money, clearly, because there wasn't any. At least not for him. For many a Knight Templar, particularly those serving in the Holy Land, their commitment wasn't just a job. It was a life sentence, albeit one often cut short by pointy things or microscopic fiends. The concept of finishing was a quaint notion best left to storytellers and people who hadn't sworn lifelong vows to a military monastic order. The concept of finishing for the day was a charming fiction for our Templar. His to-do list, if he'd had one, would have just read 1. Suffer, 2. Try not to die, 3. Repeat until otherwise instructed by God or a senior officer, whichever comes first. One task simply bled into the next, with the grim inevitability of a particularly stubborn stain. You'd spend weeks escorting a caravan of whiny merchants through bandit-infested mountain passes, dreaming of the moment you could finally hand them off. And what was your reward upon arrival? Not a week of R&R. Oh no. It was probably orders to immediately turn around and escort another group of even whinier pilgrims back the way you just came, or perhaps to reinforce a beleaguered outpost that was currently enjoying a nightly trebuchet serenade. Fixing one problem invariably created, or revealed, another. You successfully defended the castle walls from an assault? Congratulations. Now you get to spend the next month rebuilding those walls under the blazing sun, all while wondering when the next bigger assault will come. You manage to secure a local water source? Fantastic. Now you get to guard it day and night from thirsty enemies and even thirstier allies who can't be trusted not to contaminate it. The Road River Sea, or in this case the dusty, blood-soaked path of Crusader ambition, flowed in two directions, and so, conveniently, did your misery. There was no true mission-accomplished banner to unfurl, just a brief pause to patch your wounds and resharpen your sword before the next verse of the same awful song began. It was a Sisyphean struggle, but instead of a boulder, our Templar was pushing a massive, ever-expanding cartload of righteous fury, logistical nightmares, and profound existential discomfort up a very steep, very slippery hill, often while being shot at. The only real completion many of them experienced was the ultimate one, where their suffering finally ended, and their brothers unceremoniously dumped their worn-out carcass into a shallow grave, muttered a quick prayer, and then got back to the endless business of suffering themselves. Our Templar was well and truly trapped, a holy hamster in a divinely ordained wheel of hardship. His life was tethered to the grand, indifferent rhythms of campaigning seasons, religious calendars, and the perpetually optimistic, if often catastrophically flawed, strategic planning of his superiors. Winter might mean a slight lull in major battles in some regions, but it brought its own miseries. Freezing cold, damp that settled in your bones and never truly left, and the joys of trying to maintain equipment and morale in a muddy, wind-swept encampment. Spring meant the campaigning season began anew. More marching, more fighting, more opportunities for creative agony. There was no escape hatch. You couldn't just hand in your 2 weeks' notice, citing irreconcilable differences with the prevailing level of abject misery. Desertion was a grave sin and a crime, likely punished with extreme prejudice if you were caught. And where would you go anyway? A lone, identifiable Templar in hostile territory was a dead Templar. Your vows were for life. You were a cog in God's great, clanking, often inefficient war machine, destined to turn until you broke or rusted away. The only way out was usually feet first, or if the order itself was dissolved, which, spoiler alert, eventually happened, but not in a way that benefited the individual Templar's retirement plan. This lack of an exit strategy, this understanding that this was it, this was your life until it wasn't, must have carried a tremendous psychological weight. It was a commitment that dwarfed almost any modern understanding of a career. Every sunrise wasn't a new beginning. It was just the turning of another page in the same grim, repetitive chapter. Now, it would be an insult to suggest that our Templar's life contained anything approaching joy in the fluffy, modern sense of the word. That would be like finding a unicorn frolicking in a latrine pit. But even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily misery, the human spirit, that stubborn, infuriatingly resilient little weed, can sometimes find the tiniest, most improbable crack of light. These weren't moments of happiness. They were tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation, fleeting affirmations that you weren't completely dead inside yet. There might be a grim flicker of professional pride when you, or your unit, executed a battlefield maneuver perfectly, turning a sketchy situation into a less sketchy one, maybe even impressing a normally unimpressible sergeant. Not joy, mind you, but a sort of, we didn't die, and we looked vaguely competent doing it. There was the simple, profound relief of a battle won, not for glory, but for the temporary cessation of immediate, life-threatening terror. The quiet satisfaction of a well-mended piece of armor, or a horse that didn't try to bite you for once. Sometimes, a shared joke, so dark it would make a modern-day undertaker wince, could pass between brothers, a tiny spark of connection in the overwhelming gloom, or the rare, unexpected act of kindness. An older knight sharing a bit of his meager, hoarded wine with a feverish recruit, or a silent nod of acknowledgement from a respected peer after a tough fight. These weren't grand gestures, but in a world stripped bare of comfort, they could feel monumental. Perhaps the most common positive feeling was the simple relief when something awful didn't happen. The patrol that returned without being ambushed. The bread ration that was only slightly stale instead of fossilized. The night watch where the most threatening thing you encountered was your own boredom. These weren't highs. They were just a temporary return to a slightly less miserable baseline. These fleeting moments weren't about happiness. They were about endurance, a grim acknowledgement of shared existence in an unholy mess. They were the tiny, improbable fleas of grim satisfaction you might find if you looked very, very hard in the mange-ridden pelt of a Templar's daily life. They didn't make the suffering worthwhile, not by a long shot, but they might have made it just barely, microscopically, more bearable for another day. Even for a Knight Templar, who might have once believed himself invincible, a notion quickly battered out of him by reality. The years of relentless strain, poor nutrition, and battlefield batterings eventually take their toll. The human body, remarkable as it is, has its limits, especially when pushed to those limits daily for decades. And as our veteran Templar starts to falter, new blood arrives, fresh-faced and tragically optimistic, ready to step into the meat grinder. Now, Knights Templar took vows of celibacy, so our aging warrior wasn't literally passing his sword and his crippling back pain down to his biological son, but the order itself was a kind of perpetual family, always needing new recruits to replace the fallen, the diseased, and the simply worn out. The torch of their holy mission and all the attendant suffering was passed from one generation of brother knights to the next. Imagine our grizzled veteran, Sir Kixalotov but Imus, now more like Sir Kvetchasalot and Groans, watching a new batch of recruits arrive. Young men, some barely out of their teens, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, misplaced romanticism about holy war, and the dawning, dreadful understanding of just how scratchy a woolen tunic can be. He'd look at their unlined faces, their straight backs, the ingrates, their pathetic attempts to wield a heavy broadsword, and a complex bitter brew of emotions would churn within him. There was grim necessity, of course. The Order needed bodies. The Holy Land wasn't going to defend itself, or more accurately, fail to be adequately defended, without a steady stream of fresh manpower. But there might also be a flicker of something akin to pity, quickly suppressed, because pity was a weakness the Templar life tried to stamp out. He knew, with a certainty forged in years of agony, exactly what these young pups were in for. He was essentially watching them sign up for a lifetime subscription to the Misery of the Month Club, where every month was a special, extra pointy and painful edition. The teaching process, as we touched on earlier, was less about gentle mentorship and more about harsh conditioning. Our aging Templar, if tasked with training these newcomers, wouldn't be a kindly old grandfather figure sharing gentle wisdom. He'd more likely be the terrifying old sergeant who'd seen it all, died a little inside 100 times, and had zero patience for incompetence or whining. He'd bark at them, just as his own trainers had barked at him a lifetime ago. Lift that shield, you sniveling whelp. Do you want the Saracens to use it as a dinner plate after they've finished carving you up? He'd drill them relentlessly, pushing them to their limits, and then some. Because that was the only way to prepare them, even inadequately, for what was to come. And the recruits? They'd look back with those wide, youthful eyes, a mixture of awe at this legendary old warrior, terror at his ferocious demeanor, and the slow, creeping realization that their glorious inheritance was less about holy crusading and more about chronic pain and a really, really bad diet. They were stepping onto the same leaking barge of a life that was now slowly sinking under the old guard. The torch was being passed, all right. A torch that often felt like it was burning at both ends and was mostly useful for illuminating just how thoroughly screwed they all were. The Holy Land, or perhaps just the general wear and tear of being a medieval warrior monk, like a cruel moneylender, always collects its debts with interest. That chronic cough our Templar developed after that one particularly damp winter siege. It now rattled his chest like dice in a cup, each hack bringing up something unpleasant. The arthritis in his hands, once a dull ache, now made gripping his sword an exercise in pure agony, his fingers gnarled like ancient tree roots. That old knee injury from when his horse rolled on him during the battle of somewhere forgettable? It now predicted rain with uncanny, painful accuracy, and made climbing stairs feel like ascending Mount Doom. The slow, painful realization of obsolescence would dawn. The younger knights, full of irritating vigor and uncrushed spirits, would start to outpace him in drills. He couldn't quite keep up on the march. His sword arm, once a blur, now felt like it was moving through molasses. The keen eyesight that once spotted distant enemies now struggled to distinguish a Saracen from a particularly suspicious-looking shrub. The overseer's gaze, or the marshal's, would now pass over him with a new kind of assessment. Not the look of a commander evaluating a key fighting asset, but the calculating look of a man evaluating a worn-out tool. Could he still sit a horse? Could he still hold a spear in the shield wall? Even if he couldn't charge with it? How long until he was more of a burden than a benefit? There was no pension plan for a superannuated Templar, no comfortable retirement home with soft beds and sympathetic nurses. The order was a fighting machine, and its components were expected to function. When you could no longer pull your weight, when your sword felt heavier than your sins, what then? Some might be assigned lighter duties, if they were lucky, and still had some utility. Perhaps helping in the armory, tending the meager herb garden, or shouting at even younger recruits from a seated position. But for many, becoming truly infirm meant becoming redundant. A mouth to feed without the hands to earn it, in an organization that, for all its wealth, often operated on a knife edge of resources in the field. The end was often quiet and undignified, not a blaze of glory, but a slow fade in some dusty corner of a Templar preceptory, succumbing to one of the many ailments that had been nipping at his heels for years. Or perhaps, if he was deemed truly beyond use, he might be sent back to a quieter house in Europe, though that was likely rare for the rank and file. More often, he'd simply become another anonymous casualty of a life that demanded everything and, in the end, gave very little back in earthly terms. The torch he had carried, or been forced to carry, was now firmly in younger, though soon to be equally scarred hands. Kings and popes made grand speeches, their names carved onto monuments and into the self-important chronicles of the age. They dreamt of empires, of holy victories, of a world reshaped in their image. But beneath the shadow of every self-aggrandizing royal decree, every lofty bishop's sermon, every crusader castle that thrust its defiant stone fingers towards the sky, lay the unrecorded sweat, blood, and quiet desperation of countless men like our brother knight who deserved better. He wore no crown, unless you count a rusty helmet that smelled faintly of old fear and regret. He commanded no fawning courtiers, only a handful of equally miserable brothers-in-arms who probably argued with him about whose turn it was to muck out the latrines. Yet, without his relentless, monotonous toil, without his willingness to stand on a sun-blasted wall for hours, to charge into a wall of pointy death on command, or to simply endure another year of dysentery and despair, the entire grandiose, teetering edifice of the Crusader states would have collapsed even faster than it ultimately did. He, and thousands like him, were the calloused hands, the aching backs, the expendable bodies that formed the actual foundation of this ambitious, brutal, and often tragically misguided enterprise. He was the unseen ant, laboring tirelessly to build the mountain of someone else's ambition, a mountain he'd never get to stand on top of, and which would probably just end up crushing him anyway. His daily grind, the patrols, the guard duties, the skirmishes, the endless logistical nightmares of moving men and material across hostile territory. These weren't glorious footnotes in epic poems. They were the boring, vital, life-sustaining pulse of a precarious existence. He didn't just fight the big famous battles that got all the press. He fought the endless, grinding war of attrition against heat, disease, starvation, and the sheer, crushing indifference of the universe. He was the literal shield of a world that barely acknowledged his sacrifice, too busy anointing kings and arguing about theological doctrine to notice the blood seeping into the sand at his feet. No statues were raised in his specific honor, unless you count the occasional hastily carved grave marker, misspelled and soon to be forgotten. His name, Brother Generic McSuffer-a-Lot, has long since dissolved into the dust and mud of forgotten battlefields and crumbling castle foundations. If he was lucky, his passing might have earned a brief, impersonal entry in some monastic chronicle. Item, Brother Gulielmus, died of the flux. May God have mercy on his soul. Send more recruits. Yet his legacy, and that of his countless nameless comrades, is everywhere, hidden in plain sight, if you know where to look. It's in the lingering stones of those crusader castles, still stubbornly defying gravity in the Middle Eastern sun, castles built and defended with his sweat and blood. It's in the trade routes, however tenuous, that were kept open, in part, by Templar swords and lances, allowing goods and ideas, and yes, more conflict, to flow. It's in the very continuity, however brief and bloody, of those crusader kingdoms, which, for all their flaws, were a testament to human endurance and pig-headed determination. He didn't just witness history, he physically moved it, often by pushing it, kicking and screaming, in a direction it didn't particularly want to go. He was the anonymous current, the often unpleasant motive force that allowed certain aspects of his civilization to persist, to fight, to leave their mark, however scarred and controversial. The Templar Order itself left an indelible mark on European finance, military organization, and the very mythology of knighthood. And that order was nothing without the individual Templars, the men on the ground, the ones doing the actual dirty work. Their collective effort, their shared suffering, their dogged adherence to a brutal code, all contributed to the fearsome reputation and surprising longevity of their institution. They were the living bricks in that formidable, if ultimately doomed wall. So, the next time you read about the valiant crusades, the noble knights, the clash of civilizations, spare a thought for the forgotten, flea-bitten, frequently miserable Knight Templar. He sought no earthly glory, and by and large, received none. His vow of poverty was spectacularly well observed, whether he liked it or not. His reward was often a painful death in a forgotten corner of a foreign land, followed by swift obscurity. Yet, in his unceasing labor, in his stubborn endurance against truly appalling odds, in his ability to keep putting one armored boot in front of the other, despite every fiber of his being screaming for a nice sit-down, and a cup of tea that wasn't actively trying to kill him, he was more than just a sufferer. He was a fundamental, if unacknowledged, part of the great, grinding, often blood-lubricated engine that powered a significant chapter of medieval history. He wasn't just a drop in the ocean of humanity. He was part of its grim, salty, and often surprisingly resilient tide. He didn't just build castles. He inhabited the harsh reality that made such ambitions brutally necessary in the eyes of his contemporaries. His name is forgotten, his individual suffering largely unrecorded, but his collective contribution, the sum total of all that misery and effort, is woven into the very fabric of the past. He was the grit in the grand design, the uncomfortable truth beneath the heroic myth, the weary wanderer whose journey, for all its profound suckage, undeniably shaped the world he left behind. And for that, he deserves, if not our praise, then at least our slightly horrified, deeply impressed, and characteristically unsentimental acknowledgement. Rest in peace, you poor, magnificent bastard. You've earned it. Probably.